the boy science couldn't explain. In the blistering heat of the summer of 1867, long before the world learned to name the things it fears, a quiet farming settlement on the outskirts of Sedalia, Missouri, found itself touched by a presence it could not understand. The child at the center of it all was 8-year-old Timothy Caldwell, a boy whose very existence would fill the journals of Dr. Samuel Harding with trembling ink and sleepless nights. Harding, the lone physician in that forgotten corner of the Midwest, chronicled every unsettling observation with the desperation of a man trying to impose order on something that refused to fit inside the boundaries of human nature. Outsiders would have described Timothy as harmless, even adorable. He had the soft voice and shy posture that made neighbors coo with comfort. But beneath that delicate mask lived something something the science of the age could not bear to name. For half a year, a strange pattern followed Timothy like a shadow that only he could control. People died. Animals withered. Misfortune seeped into the soil wherever he walked. Those who crossed his path, 11 in all, met ends so abrupt and so inexplicable that even hardened farmers whispered prayers when his small silhouette appeared on the horizon. They said the boy smiled often, but the smile never warmed his pale blue eyes. Those eyes remained still, ancient, observant, as if they were not looking at you, but THRUGHU. Local authorities sealed the records, locked them away, and swore to silence. Yet nothing truly stays buried in a land as haunted as ours, and the truth of Timothy Caldwell forces us to question the very nature of childhood and the unimaginable depths of what a young heart may hide. Before the horrors took shape, the story began with a quieter kind of sorrow. Missouri in those years was a wounded place. The Civil War had carved grief across every doorstep, leaving behind widows with trembling hands and children who no longer remembered laughter. Sedalia was no different. Far from the reach of cities, its people tried to sew their lives back together with thread too thin to hold. The Caldwell farm, settled in a valley 15 miles south, had once been a place of ambition. James and Martha Caldwell dreamed of cattle, corn, and a legacy to pass on. But the war devoured James at Wilson's Creek, and sickness, ruthless and cold, took Martha 4 winters later. Their surviving son, Thomas, inherited land he lacked the strength to maintain and debts that seemed to grow like weeds. When word came that Thomas's brother William had died in the wretched confines of Andersonville prison, leaving behind a child and a widow fate refused to spare, Thomas saw no choice. Timothy needed shelter. Thomas needed hands to plow, harvest, mend. Hardship had chiseled Thomas into a man of stone, and his wife Sarah carried bitterness like a second skin. They were not the warm, gentle figures a grieving child might cling to. And yet, in the spring of 1866, Timothy stepped across their threshold carrying nothing but a small cloth bag and the unsettling stillness of someone who felt older than he should. He was a small thing, fair, skinned, easily burned, with hair Sarah trimmed short and neat. When adults pressed him for memories, he gave only fragments like scraps from a torn journal. His father had worn a uniform. His mother had died coughing into her hands. He had lived here and there with strangers until someone thought to send him to kin. Yet what most adults noticed was not his story, but his flawless manners. He answered softly, obeyed instantly, and endured punishment without tears. A model child, they said. Too perfect, Sarah muttered once under her breath. Dr. Harding first met the boy in June when Timothy accompanied his uncle to town. Harding, trained in Sate. Lewis and tempered by battlefield wounds he tended without rest, was slow to fear anything human. But Timothy stirred something in him, an instinctive recoil he could not justify. The boy spoke clearly, looked him in the eye, and held himself with impeccable stillness. And yet Harding's pulse quickened. He would later write that Timothy observed him like a specimen beneath glass, studying every breath, every movement, with a knowing calm that made Harding feel strangely exposed. It was as though the child carried no trace of fear, no flicker of confusion, no spark of wonder. Only calculation, only awareness. The farms surrounding the Caldwell land were few, but close enough for neighbors to notice when the air shifted. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, from the bordering property, spent many mornings watching the Caldwell boy move through the fields. What troubled her wasn't what he did, but what he didn't do. Children paused. Children wandered. Children played. Timothy did none of those things. He worked from dawn to dusk with a relentless steadiness that made Mrs. Patterson whisper to her husband at supper, "He moves like something wound too tightly." She laughed afterward, but the sound did not reach her eyes. Even the animals knew. The Pattersons kept chickens, tough, scrappy creatures used to foxes and storms. But when Timothy approached the fence line, the birds reacted as if winter frost had brushed their feathers. They huddled together in a frantic cluster, wings beating, voices shrill, refusing to go near the wooden posts separating their world from his. Mrs. Patterson told Samuel that the birds acted as though the air itself changed around the boy, as though something unseen passed with him, as though they sensed what humans refused to admit, and this was only the beginning. Her husband brushed it aside as farm gossip and nerves, but Eleanor Patterson felt an instinctive tightening in her chest whenever she recalled how the animals reacted to that child. She believed, with the quiet certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime listening to the land, that the creatures of the valley sensed a truth too subtle or too terrifying for human insight, and soon the valley would deliver its first offering to that truth. The heat that August throbbed like a heartbeat against the earth, pressing down on the fields, the trees, even the breath of those forced to work beneath its suffocating weight. It was on one such afternoon that little Mary Fletcher slipped from the world. She was known for drifting beyond the boundaries her parents set, chasing butterflies and curiosity wherever they led. That day, she wandered toward Willow Creek, a shallow ribbon of water shared by several farms, including the Caldwells. No one witnessed the moment everything changed. Only the stillness afterward. It was Timothy who arrived at the Fletcher home, his shirt damp as though he had been running, his hair sticking to his forehead, his face drained of color. He stood at the doorway just as the family gathered for supper, his small frame trembling in a way that looked like fear, but something about the stiffness in his posture made it difficult to tell. In a steady, unbroken voice, He informed Mrs. Fletcher that he had found Mary by the creek and that she would not wake. When the searchers reached the water, they discovered Mary lying face down in the gentlest trickle of the stream. Barely more than a puddle, they whispered. Barely enough to cover the face of a small child. Yet she had drowned there, motionless, without a sign of struggle. Dr. Harding was summoned at once. The physician had seen countless accidents in his years of treating both soldiers and settlers, but something about Mary's death settled uneasily against his thoughts. The tragedy itself was familiar enough, but Timothy's description of what he had seen gnawed at him, like a persistent echo. The boy spoke with unsettling precision. He described the angle of Mary's arms, the way her dress had tangled on a branch beneath the water, the exact shade of the creek around her lifeless face. It was not the rambling recollection of a shocked child. It was clinical, composed, too perfect. When Harding asked how he had happened to be in that very place at that very moment, Timothy gave a simple explanation. He was searching for a missing calf. The calf had vanished that morning, and Thomas Caldwell confirmed that he had indeed sent the boy down toward the creek. Yet the animal was found days later grazing peacefully in a meadow far from the water. A coincidence, they said. Just a coincidence. The town mourned. The Fletchers clung to the small comfort that Timothy had alerted them quickly, that he had tried, at least outwardly, to help. During the funeral, the boy sat beside his aunt and uncle with his head bowed, hands folded neatly in his lap, not a movement out of place. When Mary's father thanked him for his swift action, Timothy responded with perfect courtesy, softly expressing that he wished he had discovered her sooner. His voice wavered at all the right moments, but across the chapel, Eleanor Patterson watched him with a tightening suspicion. She noticed what no one else did, or perhaps what no one else dared to confront. When Mary's grieving mother collapsed, when men who had survived war wept openly at the sight of the small coffin, Timothy's face remained unchanged. His posture mimicked sorrow, but his eyes, those pale, icy eyes, remained dry. They flickered across the room, observing each tremor of grief with a calm that chilled Eleanor's blood. It was as though he were cataloging the moment rather than mourning it. The valley did not wait long before demanding a second life. 3 weeks passed under a sky that refused to rain, and then the news spread through the farms like smoke. Old Henrik Larsen had been found dead at the base of Devil's Bluff, the jagged outcrop overlooking the same creek. Where Mary had died, Henrik had tended wild beehives on the cliffside for years, climbing those rocks with a familiarity earned through repetition and solitude. Yet somehow, the old man had fallen, and once again, it was Timothy who came bearing word of the tragedy. He told the gathering onlookers that he had been returning from town when he noticed Henrik's hat caught in a thorn bush. When the old man failed to answer his calls, Timothy said he climbed down and saw the broken body at the bottom of the bluff. His tone held the perfect measure of shock. His story flowed smoothly, almost rehearsed. Dr. Harding examined Henrik's body and determined the fall had snapped his neck instantly. What unsettled him was not the nature of the injury, but the strange scattering of dead bees around the corpse. It looked unnatural, as though the insects had dropped mid-flight and fallen in a tight circle around the old man. If Henrik had disturbed a hive and been attacked, the path between the cliff edge and his resting place should have been littered with signs of their fury. But only the impact site carried the swarm's remains, like a macabre halo. Harding climbed the bluff himself, expecting to find a ravaged hive, comms torn apart by a frightened man swatting blindly as he tumbled. Instead, every hive was intact, undisturbed, quiet. The scene at the top bore no sign of struggle. The bees had not been agitated. There had been no frantic flight, no chaos, only silence, and once again, impossibly, uncomfortably, the boy was there. Timothy stood beside the doctor, gazing down at the bluffs with an expression too calm for a child who had stumbled upon a second death in so short a time. The wind moved through the valley, stirring the grass, but not the boy's stillness. And Eleanor Patterson, watching from afar, felt the fast true tardo fvr tighten around her heart, for the valley was changing, and the child at its center was no longer just strange. He was becoming something fire moar tarifing. The bees drifted in lazy spirals through the late summer flowers, their movements calm and ordinary, as if the world around them had not begun to rot with quiet, spreading dread. They carried on with their small, unhurried rituals, unaware that the valley was inching toward yet another tragedy, one that would collapse any comfortable notion of coincidence. It came with the disappearance of little Jacob Mills. One moment he had been playing near the trees outside his family's small cabin, delighting in the shade and the chirping in the branches overhead. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the woods, as though the earth itself had opened and taken him. His parents searched until their voices cracked, and neighbors combed the forest paths with lanterns, calling his name long after the sun fell. But no one found a trace of him, not even a footprint in the damp soil. Timothy joined the search with the earnestness of a child, supposedly desperate to help. For 3 days he moved through the forest as though he belonged to it, his energy baffling the adults who lagged behind him. He slipped between trees with uncanny ease, guiding the volunteers along routes rarely used, pausing now and then to point out a trail, a broken stem, a subtle shift in the ground that only he seemed able to read. When asked how he knew the woods so well, he offered a simple explanation. He wandered often, gathering herbs for his aunt, exploring, learning. It was on the 4th day that he appeared at the Mills cabin before the sky had fully brightened, his face pale with exhaustion and something harder to name. He told Jacob's father he had found a place worth checking, an old well hidden beneath fallen branches, a place he claimed he had passed by only because he heard a sound that reminded him of crying. He led them north, past thickets and over old hunting paths, until the structure came into view, its stone rim nearly erased by time and decay. Logs and brush concealed it with such convincing naturalness that even seasoned woodsmen might have missed it. Jacob lay at the bottom, barely alive when they hauled him out. His skin was colorless, his body limp, his breath thin as thread. Dr. Harding arrived swiftly, but there was little he could do. The boy lingered between worlds for only a few hours before slipping beyond reach. unable to recover from 4 long days, trapped in the cold dark beneath the earth. Harding wrote later that the discovery unsettled him in ways he could not ignore. The well was too well hidden. The boy had been too weak to call out. And Timothy, always Timothy, had known where to look. What troubled Harding even more was the child's behavior inside the mill's cabin during Jacob's final hours. While the family bent over their son, whispering hope into his fading consciousness, Timothy sat off to the side, his hands folded as if in prayer. But Harding, watching from a position where the boy could not see him, saw the truth of those motions. Timothy's lips moved, but not in any prayer Harding recognized. His gaze never left Jacob's twitching, failing body. There was a chill in those pale eyes, a fascination that should never live in a child's face. He watched the dying boy's breaths, counted them perhaps, studied each tremor as though he were memorizing the mechanics of suffering. And when Jacob finally exhaled for the last time, Timothy's expression did not collapse into sorrow or shock. Instead, a faint curve touched his lips, not joy, not relief, but an eerie flicker of satisfaction, gone as quickly as it appeared, like a shadow retreating behind a door. The funeral was brief and heartbreakingly quiet. Harding felt no comfort afterward, only an expanding unease that gnawed at his mind. That evening he made his way to the abandoned well. Something inside him demanded it, as if the earth itself whispered that he must look again. He knelt beside the opening and examined the brush that had concealed it. The branches did not lie where chance would have dropped them. They had been set carefully, layered in a way that mimicked chaos while maintaining deliberate placement. The logs bore markings, tiny scrapes, shifted bark that suggested hands had worked them into place. Harding felt a coldness crawl up his spine as understanding dawned. Jacob had not stumbled into that pit. He had been placed there, hidden, left to weaken until rescue would come too late. The idea was so monstrous that speaking it aloud seemed impossible. Still, Harding could not shake it from his mind. That night he opened a fresh journal and began documenting every detail he could recall about Timothy Caldwell. If there was a pattern, he would uncover it. If there was danger, someone had to face it. But what unsettled him most was how flawlessly the boy blended into the fabric of everyday life. Timothy attended church, bowing his head with solemn devotion. He worked without complaint, completing chores that would exhaust most grown men. He spoke with impeccable politeness, showing elders the respect the community cherished, and every time tragedy struck, he was nearby, always with an explanation that seemed harmless, almost reasonable. Searching for a calf when Mary drowned, walking home when Henrik fell, volunteering to help when Jacob vanished. But Harding had treated too many soldiers not to recognize a certain emptiness that lay behind the eyes of those who killed without remorse. It was subtle, a void where empathy should live, a stillness in the face of horror, a curiosity toward suffering that felt colder than winter itself. And now he saw that same void in the calm, watchful stare of Timothy Caldwell, a child who should have feared death the way the living naturally do. A child who seemed instead to study it. A child who lingered too close to every shadow the valley wished to forget. And somewhere inside Harding's tightening chest rose a terrible truth. The valley was not cursed. It was being observed by a boy whose soul did not move like the souls of other children, by a boy who watched suffering as though it were a lesson, by a boy who stood at the edge of every tragedy, silent, patient, waiting. Timothy Caldwell had become the quiet pulse of something dark, something that was only beginning. Timothy Caldwell carried those unsettling traits with him, like an invisible cloak, traits that belonged not to a child, but to something older, colder, and infinitely more patient. In the small frame of an 8-year-old, those qualities became even more disturbing, as though the darkness within him had been compressed, pressurized, sharpened into something deceptively quiet. Dr. Harding began to see this in October, when the first breath of autumn crept through the valley and the last warmth of summer faltered. The doctor's rounds gave him a perfect excuse to visit every farm recovering from the aftermath of war. But beneath the polite greetings and routine examinations, he was searching for threads, whispers, patterns, anything that might reveal what Timothy really was. And everywhere he looked, the same shadow waited for him. Families spoke in low voices of animals dying in ways no one could explain. Not from illness, not from predators, but from injuries that felt too precise, too intentional, as though someone had approached each creature with a strange mixture of curiosity and calculation. Chickens found at dawn with their necks bent at immaculate angles, as if touched by an invisible hand. Pigs that developed wounds no animal should have survived, wounds that festered with unnatural speed. Horses, strong and trusted for years, suddenly collapsing with legs shattered in ways no accident could fully account for. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson was the first to speak openly. She pulled Harding aside, her hands trembling not from age, but from fear she didn't yet understand. She whispered about the hens she kept losing, one at a time, always found lifeless in the grey morning light. She spoke of silence, no signs of struggle, no tracks from foxes, nothing disturbed except the birds themselves. When the doctor knelt beside the most recent bodies, the truth settled over him like a cold sheet. These deaths were not wild. They were exact. Someone had applied pressure with perfect knowledge of where to strike, how to break, how to end life quickly without damaging anything else. And the pattern extended outward, down familiar dirt roads, and through the weather-beaten fences of neighboring farms. A calf that had supposedly entangled itself in a rope. Another found wedged between rails in a position no creature could naturally reach. A bull that had stumbled with uncanny precision into the only ditch deep enough to cripple it. In each case, someone noticed the same thing. A small figure wandering nearby, always polite, always smiling, always greeting them with the gentle manner of a well-raised child. Timothy. Harding held each account like a fragile shard of truth. He said nothing aloud, but the circle was tightening, and at the center of it stood the boy who never seemed surprised by loss, the boy whose eyes lingered too long on things that suffered. When Harding visited the Caldwell farm, the boy was always there, hovering at the edge of the doctor's work, watching with an attentiveness that made the doctor's skin crawl. Timothy never interrupted, but he observed every gesture, Every examination, every breath Harding took, his questions slid softly into the air, questions no child should ask with such calm interest. How to tell when someone had truly slipped beyond life? Whether bodies could pretend to be dead? How long certain injuries took to finish their work? He spoke of death the way others spoke of chores. When Harding pressed him gently, Timothy smiled that careful, well-mannered smile and said, he simply wanted to know what to do if there was an accident on the farm. A perfectly reasonable explanation, delivered with the perfect sincerity of a child who had learned how to mimic innocence flawlessly. Yet behind his words, Harding felt the faint tremor of something wrong, something that observed pain, with an almost scientific fascination. He began testing Timothy, offering small falsehoods wrapped in medical jargon to see how the boy reacted. Timothy never corrected him, never questioned him, but his eyes absorbed everything, storing it away like a predator memorizing the habits of prey. It was the quiet attention that frightened Harding the most, not the questions themselves, but the hunger behind them. Whenever the doctor mentioned the war, Timothy leaned closer, listening not with fear or pity, but with a rapt, analytical stillness. The descriptions of shattered limbs, collapsing lungs, soldiers gasping through torn throats, these things didn't disturb him. They interested him. He wanted to know how bodies failed, how long they held on, whether agony made men silent or made them scream. The question he asked on a cold afternoon in late autumn sank its teeth into Harding's memory and never let go. He had been speaking of amputations, how some soldiers begged to be unconscious before the blade touched bone. Timothy looked up, his pale eyes shining, and asked whether the ones who didn't faint cried out, whether their voices broke, or whether the pain was so deep it stole sound itself. His tone was mild, curious, polite. It chilled Harding to his core. By November, the doctor's journals had swollen with pages of uneasy observations, every word written in cramped, urgent strokes, every line revealing more clearly a truth he wished he could unsee. Timothy Caldwell possessed an understanding of injury no child should hold, combined with a terrible emptiness where compassion should have lived. He was a mirror without reflection, a vessel without warmth, a presence that moved through the valley like a silent storm. Yet, for all the chilling evidence written in Harding's notebooks, none of it was enough to confront what he feared. A community could not be warned with suspicions. A monster could not be stopped with journal entries. Timothy walked freely, smiled easily, prayed carefully, worked diligently, and with each passing day, something in the valley bent closer toward him, as though drawn by an invisible gravity. And Harding understood, with growing dread, that whatever surrounded the boy was not finished. It was only gathering strength. It was only waiting. It was only beginning. The chance to uncover the truth arrived quietly, almost innocently, when Thomas Caldwell's back gave out beneath the weight of the harvest. His injury confined him to bed and required Dr. Harding's daily care, granting the physician a level of access to the household that he had never possessed before. Within those weathered walls, under the pretext of tending to the ailing farmer, Harding began to watch the boy more closely, letting their conversations stretch longer than they ever had, letting silence expand so he could observe what rose to fill it. What surfaced first was a flicker, a subtle shift in the boy's eyes whenever discussions drifted near pain, near injury, near the delicate line that separates suffering from death. But that flicker soon grew teeth, and what Harding uncovered exceeded even the worst fears he had carried in secret. Timothy had been experimenting on living creatures, not casually, not impulsively, with intention, with method, with the cold focus of someone studying the mechanics of life itself, through careful questions and the quiet patience of a man who had seen too much misery in war. Harding pieced together a truth so monstrous he could scarcely believe it. The boy had been capturing animals for months, perhaps years, subjecting them to injuries he created and catalogued, watching their reactions with the kind of fascination that only grows in an empty heart. One afternoon, as if speaking of a place no more remarkable than a fishing pond, Timothy mentioned a cave he visited when he wanted solitude. Something in his tone, the faint quickening of his breath, drove Harding to investigate. The cave waited like an open mouth in the hillside, cool and still. Inside, the doctor found the remnants of a hidden universe carved from cruelty, piles of bones arranged with eerie order, farm tools reshaped into crude instruments of dissection, and drawings, dozens of them, laid out with meticulous care. The sketches were the first thing he truly could not breathe through. They were detailed, disturbingly competent illustrations of rabbits, birds, squirrels, and other creatures, each captured in some stage of torment or disassembly. Beneath them were neat, almost elegant notes, documenting how long the animals remained conscious, which wounds made them cry out, which made them fall silent. One notation described how long a rabbit lived after the removal of its eyes. Another analyzed how breath changed when pressure was applied to the throat. The handwriting was small, precise, and unmistakably Timothy's. Harding sank deeper into horror as he realized that the animals from neighboring farms, those strange injuries, those inexplicable deaths, had not been accidents or the work of predators. They had been trials, practice, rehearsal. The boy had been refining his methods. But it was the new drawings, the ones tucked deeper into the cave, that tore away any hope the man still clung to. These were not animals. These were people, slender figures of children bent at unnatural angles, adults collapsing beneath invisible blows, bodies marked with annotations about potential vulnerabilities, imagined responses to trauma. Among them, unmistakable in posture and shape, was Mary Fletcher, the valley's first small tragedy. Another image portrayed Henrik Len. A third showed Jacob Mills curled in the darkness of a well, surrounded by notes analyzing the effects of exposure and thirst on the human frame. Timothy had not wandered innocently into tragedy. He had orchestrated each death with chilling clarity. Planned, executed, recorded, improved. The boy had been studying the valley, the way a surgeon might study a textbook, and its residents had been reduced to subjects in his expanding experiment of suffering. And Sedalia County had no idea that their nightmare had only begun. Harding returned from the cave hollowed out and trembling, caught in a silence too heavy to share. Even with the truth in his hands, He knew he could not bring it into the light. The cave was trespassed ground, evidence taken improperly, and worst of all, the world did not yet possess a language for what Timothy was. Medical science had no name for a child born without the ability to feel anything for another living soul, a mind shaped around curiosity instead of conscience, a heart that did not warm, did not soften, did not break. If Harding spoke, he would be dismissed as a man frayed by war. Timothy would be pitied, defended, protected, and the dying would continue. So the doctor chose a path that was half madness, half desperation. He decided to confront the boy face to face. The next day, he asked Timothy to accompany him to the far pasture under the guise of checking on the livestock. The fields lay empty, washed in pale autumn light. When Harding finally spoke, he told Timothy everything he had found in the cave. The bones, the tools, the drawings, the boy's experiments laid bare. Timothy did not gasp, did not flinch, did not attempt even the smallest lie. Instead, he listened with the patience of someone waiting for the end of a long, predictable story. When the doctor finished, the child looked up with an expression Harding had never seen before. An emotion that felt too alive to be innocence, yet too calm to be fear. "You're not going to tell anyone," the boy said. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Harding, shaken but clinging to reason, asked why he believed that. Timothy's lips curved into a faint, genuine smile, the first real smile Harding had ever witnessed on that pale face. A smile that felt like a door quietly closing. "Because no one would believe you," he whispered. "And because you want to know what I'm going to do next." Both truths struck Harding like blows, and as Timothy's words settled into the quiet field, the doctor felt something colder than fear seep into him. For the boy was right. The haunted was only unfolding only under its willings. He had always suspected there was something festering behind the boy's stillness, but nothing prepared Dr. Harding for the moment. Timothy finally spoke freely, as if unmasking himself at last. There was no tremor in the child's voice, no flicker of shame, only a calm, clinical honesty, as though he were discussing weather patterns or crop yields. He admitted that his fascination had begun long before anyone realized, long before he even understood the meaning of fear or pain in other beings. He said he had started when he was barely old enough to read, testing what creatures could endure, observing how long they clung to life, learning the fragile thresholds of breath and bone. And then, without a change in tone, he mentioned the people who had died, as if they were simply larger versions of the earlier subjects he had dismantled. The confession hit Harding like a plunge into ice, but the true horror came when he asked the boy what he planned to explore next. Timothy paused, thoughtful, as though the question required sincere philosophical consideration. Then he spoke of wanting to see what happened when harm was inflicted upon someone who believed utterly in their safety. Someone who trusted the hand that approached them, someone who would never suspect betrayal until the last possible moment. The implication struck with the force of a physical blow. He was speaking of his aunt, his uncle, the very people who had given him shelter, who had clung to him with the desperate hope that love could soften whatever storm lived inside him. Dr. Harding realized he had almost no time. The boy had spoken not with the excitement of a child imagining mischief, but with the resolve of someone preparing to finish a long-studied experiment. Harding felt the clock ticking beneath his ribs as he rode to Sedalia that evening, the cold wind clawing at his coat, carrying with it the weight of what he had to reveal. Sheriff William Crawford listened with a soldier's steady patience, his stern face tightening as Harding laid out the facts one by one. There was no room for theories or speculation here, only the unignorable connections between death, injury, and the silent boy at their center. When Harding handed over the drawings taken from the cave, those grotesquely detailed illustrations, etched with an understanding no 8-year-old should possess, the sheriff's hardened composure cracked. He had seen the worst of war, but he had never seen cruelty documented with such cold artistry. Even so, a child could not be arrested for sketches. The law was not built for horrors such as this, but the sheriff and his trusted men, veterans shaped by hardship, could shadow the boy from a distance. They could watch. They could wait. They could intervene the moment the child attempted to strike. Together, they shaped a fragile, desperate plan. Harding would visit the Caldwells as usual, carrying medicine that would dull pain, but also ensure they remained safely unconscious, out of Timothy's reach. Meanwhile, Crawford and his deputies would encircle the farm quietly, ready to move the instant the boy revealed his intentions. But when Harding returned the next morning, dread settled into his bones before he even stepped out of his buggy. The farm stood in a strange stillness, stripped of the usual morning chorus. No chickens scratching the dirt, no grunts from the pig pens, no clatter of movement in the barn. The land felt emptied, as though every living thing had fallen silent. Holding its breath, Timothy materialized in the doorway, waiting, his small frame outlined by the dim light behind him. There was something sharper in his eyes now, something that felt less like curiosity and more like expectation. His sleeves were pushed high above his elbows, and his arms had the look of someone who had scrubbed away every trace of what he had been doing. The sight made Harding's throat tighten. The boy offered a polite greeting, but underneath it shimmered an excitement he could not fully hide. He said he had been waiting, and the way he said it made Harding feel as if he had stepped directly into a trap woven with invisible threads. Inside, the doctor found the Caldwells lying in a heavy, unnatural sleep. Their chests rose in shallow, uneven breaths, and their skin carried a strange ashen tone. As Harding leaned over Thomas, examining him with a trembling hand, he sensed Timothy behind him, watching with the keen interest of a scientist awaiting the interpretation of his results. When he asked what Timothy had given them, the boy answered softly, almost brightly. He spoke of wild plants, of their secret properties, of how many wonders grew silently in the forest if one only bothered to learn their nature. The innocence in his voice made the words even more chilling. Harding checked both patients. They were deeply unconscious, but their bodies still clung to life. The dosages had been precise, intentional. Timothy had not wanted them dead, not yet. He wanted them helpless. He wanted them ready. As Harding stepped back, his heartbeat pounded with a cold realization. Timothy had chosen this day, this hour. He had chosen the moment Harding would arrive. The boy had expected him, anticipated him, planned for him. Everything was unfolding according to some silent script the child had been writing alone in the dark. The farmhouse felt different now, as though the walls themselves sensed the storm rising within the boy. Timothy's gaze followed Harding with a predator's patience, and beneath that pale politeness, something electric and unfinished crackled, as though he were standing on the edge of the next chapter of his terrible evolution. And outside, unseen beyond the windows, the sheriff and his men waited in the quiet fields, unaware that the horror moving inside the house was already several steps ahead of them. For Timothy Caldwell had set the stage, and the nightmare of Gospel of the Haunted was preparing to breathe. Timothy spoke with the ease of someone beginning a pleasant exchange, his voice light, almost cheerful, as if they were about to discuss the weather rather than the quiet storm building in his mind. He mentioned that they had ample time, that no one would disturb them, and the certainty in his tone made the room feel smaller, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. What came next pulled Dr. Harding into a darkness he had studied, but never truly met. The boy talked of torment and death, with a calmness that hollowed the air, his tone detached, almost scholarly, as though recounting a series of harmless observations rather than atrocities crafted by his own hands. He spoke of the creatures he had tested, the bodies he had watched fail, the patterns he had learned from endings. Each detail unfurled with surgical precision, and Dr. Harding felt his heart begin to thrum in a slow dread as Timothy settled into a chair, his expression bright, his posture relaxed. When the boy mentioned the creek, and the girl who had never risen from it, the doctor felt cold seep into his bones. Timothy described the moment with a kind of wonder, explaining how she had fought, how she had clawed at the water, how breath had betrayed her in stuttering attempts, before silence took its place. He spoke of it the way a child might describe a curious insect, something unexpected, something fascinating, something worth repeating. Dr. Harding could barely breathe. The boy confirmed it without shame, even leaning forward slightly, as though sharing a cherished memory. He described how easily he had deceived her, how small her body had felt beneath his hands, how resistance had surprised him, how he learned that humans clung to life with a ferocity that animals lacked. His eyes glimmered with pride, as if this insight were a prize he had earned through diligence. Then he shifted seamlessly to the man by the cliffs, describing the older victim with a thoughtful seriousness, admitting that the situation had required planning rather than strength. He told the doctor how he had prepared the ground the night before, loosening the stones bit by bit beneath the moonlight, then gathering insects from the hives to weaponize panic. Dr. Harding listened in horror as Timothy explained how he had ambushed the man, how he had hurled the writhing bag at his face and shouted warnings of imaginary swarms. He described how the man had recoiled, how his footing had slipped just where Timothy intended, how gravity had done the rest. The pride in his voice deepened. The precision of his planning had been flawless, but the worst came next. Timothy's tone shifted into something disturbingly warm, like a teacher recalling a favorite lesson. He spoke of the boy who had vanished in the woods, how he had lured him with a tale of helpless animals, how easily compassion had been manipulated into obedience. He described guiding the boy down into the darkness of the abandoned well, then sealing him inside as though closing a lid over an experiment. Timothy described the days that followed with an unsettling softness, explaining how he had visited, offering sips of water to prolong the boy's suffering just enough. He watched desperation mature into despair, as though observing a flower bloom in slow motion. By the time Timothy paused, savoring the memory of his cruelty, Dr. Harding understood with sick clarity that these were not stories of the past alone. These were the boy's foundations, his rehearsal, his preparation for what he intended to do next. The doctor forced his voice to remain steady as he asked what Timothy planned for the two sleeping in the house. The smile that spread across the child's face was broader than any Dr. Harding had ever seen from him, bright and chilling. The boy explained that unlike the others, who had walked blindly into the unknown, the doctor possessed knowledge. He understood the danger. He recognized Timothy for what he truly was. That, Timothy said, made him invaluable. A rare subject capable of fear and awareness, someone who would contribute to a new kind of test. As he spoke, Timothy drifted through the room like a quiet storm gathering momentum. He selected rope with the same care one might choose a paintbrush. He lifted a heavy metal ornament, as though gouging its balance. He placed sharpened tools in a neat row, aligning them like instruments, prepared for a meticulous operation. There was a ritualistic grace in his movements, a chilling anticipation shining beneath his calm. He wondered aloud how Dr. Harding might behave once he realized that death was no longer theoretical, but imminent. Would he give himself over to protect those he cared for? Would he attempt to fight even though the boy already anticipated every possibility? Would he run? Give up the people who trusted him in a desperate grasp for survival? Each question dripped with fascination, and the boy's excitement began to pulse through the room like heat. Dr. Harding knew then that speaking to the boy had become futile. Action was the only path left. He reached into his bag with a tremor of resolve, pulled out the pistol, and pointed it directly at Timothy. He ordered him away from the tools. His own voice sounded distant, as though someone else were speaking through him. Timothy, however, regarded the weapon with the same interest he'd shown everything else. He identified it easily, admiring it like a museum piece, then did something far worse. He calculated. He tallied the lives at risk, counted the bullets aloud, and smiled at the conclusion that followed. Even if the doctor acted, the boy told him softly, the math did not lie. The odds belonged to him. And then, stepping forward without fear, Timothy asked the question that made the air itself tighten. Did the doctor want to know how something so monstrous had first opened its eyes? For the house seemed to lean inward as he spoke, and the nightmare of gospel of the haunted waited, trembling on the edge of revelation. The room seemed to shrink around Dr. Harding as Timothy Caldwell's voice wove through the shadows, almost melodic in its chilling cadence. "You want to know how I became what I am?" the boy said, eyes glinting with a curiosity that was not innocent. The words were slow, deliberate, meant to draw the doctor into a conversation he could not escape, a trap disguised as discourse. "You want to understand whether I was born this way, or if the world shaped me into this form. You want to know if others like me exist, and how to recognize them before they begin the work I have already begun." Every syllable pressed against Dr. Harding's mind like ice, each question a probe into the darkness that the boy had carried since infancy. Timothy did not merely speak. He dissected the very thoughts of those who listened, manipulating understanding with the precision of a surgeon, the detachment of a scientist, and the instinct of a predator. In a movement both sudden and deliberate, Timothy stepped toward his sleeping uncle, a length of rope coiled in his small hands. Dr. Harding lunged instinctively, but the boy's speed was unnerving, a blur of pale limbs and preternatural agility. The glint of the kitchen knife flashed in the lamplight as it cut through the air, raking across Dr. Harding's arm with a sharpness that sang in the silence. Pain exploded, but there was no time to flinch. The struggle was immediate, violent, desperate. Timothy's smaller frame was no disadvantage. He moved with the precision of one who had studied the human body, exploiting every lever, every joint, every weakness. Dr. Harding twisted a wrist, forcing the knife from the boy's grip. But Timothy had prepared contingencies. Another blade appeared, hidden in the folds of his clothing, ready, waiting, a reminder of how long he had honed this craft. The scuffle echoed through the house, a violent rhythm that summoned Sheriff Crawford and his deputies from their hidden positions outside. They burst through the back door to find the scene. Dr. Harding grappling with a child whose very presence seemed to radiate menace, while Thomas and Sarah Caldwell lay unconscious in their bed, oblivious to the unfolding horror. Deputy Mitchell moved with swift efficiency, subduing the boy before further catastrophe could occur. Dr. Harding, breath ragged, checked the couple, finding them alive but dangerously close to harm. And there, in the corner, sat Timothy Caldwell, clothes torn, skin smeared with blood, yet the same pale blue eyes gleaming with intelligence and cold calculation that had haunted the doctor for months. "You can't prove anything," Timothy said, his tone almost conversational, almost amused. "Nobody will believe that a child did all those things." There was an unsettling certainty in his words, a confidence that brushed against the edges of madness. Sheriff Crawford crouched slightly, meeting the boy's gaze, a mixture of disgust, and reluctant recognition etched across his face. "Maybe not," the sheriff admitted slowly, "but we don't need to prove everything. Attempting to kill your family is enough to see you locked away, regardless of your age." Timothy smiled, the kind of smile that did not comfort but unsettled, the same genuine display Dr. Harding had glimpsed the day before. "You won't hang me," he said. "I'm too young and too interesting. Someone will want to study me instead." Even as the law struggled to comprehend what had occurred, the shadows of Sedalia County seemed to lengthen, heavy and expectant. Timothy's crimes were vast, but the legal and moral frameworks of 1867 were not built to contain such a child. Drawings from the cave, meticulous and grotesque, were dismissed by prosecutors as the figments of a disturbed mind. Deaths and accidents were labeled coincidental, each misfortune attributed to the boy's unfortunate proximity. But the attempted murder of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell defied reason, witnessed as it had been by officers who could not deny the intent radiating from the child's actions. An 8-year-old wielding knives against family members. There was no precedent, no guide for the courts to follow. The case became a maelstrom, drawing legal minds and medical experts from across Missouri and beyond, desperate to grasp a child who embodied both intellect and malice in equal measure. Weeks of deliberation, consultation with distant specialists from Boston and Philadelphia, culminated in a compromise. Timothy was to be placed in the Missouri State Hospital for the insane at Fulton, under the care of the region's most advanced alienists, where he would be studied, observed, and, perhaps, restrained. The decision pleased no one entirely. Prosecutors demanded justice, defenses argued innocence, and physicians debated the very nature of Timothy's mind, rehabilitatable or irreparably dangerous. Dr. Samuel Harding, bound by duty and perhaps fascination, accompanied Timothy to the hospital, staying for months to document behavior, record responses, and attempt to unravel the enigma of the boy, who had orchestrated death with the same serenity with which others might have played a game of chess. These records would become the first comprehensive study of antisocial behavior in children. Though their publication would be delayed for decades, the world unready to confront such unfiltered malevolence. In the sterile corridors of Fulton, Timothy adapted swiftly, observing, calculating, and integrating into the routines of the hospital with a quiet mastery that mirrored his life on the farm. The pale blue eyes that had terrorized Sedalia County now scanned the environment with a predator's attentiveness, measuring staff, studying protocols, testing boundaries. And though confined, the darkness in him remained, contained perhaps, but unextinguished, waiting for opportunity, patient, inexorable. In the echoes of those quiet wards, Dr. Harding sometimes wondered if the world had truly glimpsed the full extent of what it was dealing with. For Timothy Caldwell was not just a boy, not merely a criminal, not merely a subject of study. He was a force of curiosity and horror, an intelligence without the tether of empathy, a soul whose shadow stretched far beyond the walls of Fulton. And the nightmare of gospel of the haunted, he realized, had not ended in that room, had not been contained in the records or in the shouts of lawmen, but lingered still, ready to emerge whenever human caution faltered, waiting for the eyes that dared to look too closely. The story of Timothy Caldwell remained, as it always would, a whisper against the grain of human understanding, a lesson in how innocence can be a mask for something far older, far colder. And in every creaking floorboard, every quiet pause in a seemingly safe room, the pulse of that darkness could still be felt, reminding all who listened that some nightmares do not sleep, and some children are born already aligned with the shadows. And so, even behind hospital walls, the legend of Timothy Caldwell endured, a chilling testament to a mind unrestrained by conscience, a haunting figure whose pale eyes seemed always to follow, always to know, always to wait. The Gospel of the Haunted had not simply recorded his story. It had become a warning, a testament to the thin line between curiosity and cruelty, and the terrifying truth that monsters sometimes arrive in the bodies of children, smiling innocently, while the world debates whether they should be caged or studied, never quite understanding the depth of their darkness. The corridors of the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane were quiet, but not peaceful. Timothy Caldwell moved through them like a shadow, an observer and manipulator in one small, calculating body. At first glance, he seemed to adapt to the routines, the rules, and the constraints placed upon him. He cried at the right moments, expressed remorse in tones that could convince the most compassionate, and offered gratitude that seemed heartfelt. Staff marveled at his apparent progress, believing they had uncovered a young mind capable of redemption. But Dr. Harding saw through the facade. He recognized the performance for what it was, a meticulous study, a deliberate simulation of emotion, a cataloging of human reactions that the boy could replicate without ever truly feeling them. The Journal of Timothy Caldwell was a masterclass in deception. With pencil and paper supplied for therapeutic exercises, he appeared to record innocent thoughts, regrets over past misdeeds, and reflections on his rehabilitation. Each entry seemed childlike, sincere, and full of potential for redemption. But beneath the surface lay something far darker. Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, applying her knowledge of European psychiatric techniques, uncovered a hidden cipher in Timothy's writing. The innocent prose masked precise observations, analyses of the hospital's routines, and assessments of every staff member's vulnerabilities. He wrote of sympathy he had elicited, trust he had earned, and how it could be used to facilitate physical access when the opportunity arose. Every tear shed, every word of gratitude, was part of a grand experiment in manipulation. Dr. Harding's reports painted a chilling picture. Timothy's cognitive abilities were exceptional, matched only by the complete absence of genuine emotional experience. Happiness, sadness, empathy, these were merely masks he wore to manipulate the world around him. Staff began to notice oddities: patients dying unexpectedly, accidents occurring in suspicious circumstances, the occasional whisper that Timothy had been watching at night. Elderly men and women succumbed to apparent heart failure after interactions with him. Younger patients fell, seriously injured, in ways that seemed more than coincidental. Observers began to feel the weight of his presence, even when he was confined to his room, haunted by the certainty that Timothy's attention was never far away. Nightmares plagued the nurses. Dreams of violence, meticulously detailed, repeated themselves until sleep became a fragile illusion. Two attendants requested transfers, citing an unshakable sense of surveillance, a feeling that their every move was being catalogued by those pale, unblinking eyes. Every gesture, every weakness noted, fed into Timothy's growing understanding of human behavior and institutional mechanics. He learned, adapted, and thrived, a predator under the guise of a recovering child. Timothy's fantasies extended far beyond the confines of the hospital. He spoke hypothetically at first, once he had secured Dr. Harding's confidence, of scenarios that made his previous crimes seem mild. Plans of psychological and physical torment were described in clinical, precise language. His creativity in cruelty was terrifying, his understanding of human reaction unparalleled for a child. If granted freedom and resources, Dr. Harding wrote, Timothy would be among the most dangerous individuals in American history. And then, one summer morning in 1868, the boy vanished. The official record offered a mundane explanation, a transfer between buildings, lapses in supervision, an improbable but possible escape. Dr. Harding, however, understood the truth. Timothy's patience, his planning, his manipulation of the staff's perceptions over months, had all culminated in this disappearance. The escape was not hurried or accidental. It was meticulous, orchestrated, and complete. Evidence left behind suggested that Timothy had leveraged the trust he cultivated, the routines he had mapped, and the vulnerabilities he had uncovered to vanish without a trace. No one had truly known the full extent of his designs until it was too late. Timothy Caldwell's life in confinement had been a laboratory. The hospital itself had been both the stage and the subject of his studies. He watched, he tested, and he recorded, turning human empathy and institutional oversight into instruments of his own design. Those who thought they were teaching him lessons were merely part of the curriculum, unwitting participants in experiments that would one day unfold beyond the walls. And when he departed, he left behind a wake of unanswered questions, uneasy staff, and a record that would haunt Dr. Harding for the rest of his life. The Gospel of the Haunted did not simply recount these events. It held them, preserved in the trembling air between observation and understanding, as a warning that the natural order of childhood and innocence can sometimes conceal something far older, far colder. Timothy Caldwell's story was a study in the dangers of intellect untethered from empathy, of curiosity that becomes cruelty, of a mind capable of playing the world as one would a game. And so the nightmare continued. Patients slept uneasily in their rooms. Staff moved with subtle hesitation, and the shadows of the hospital seemed to shift with intent, as though aware that one of their own had once walked these halls with calculating grace. Dr. Harding recorded every incident, every subtle manipulation, every eerie observation, knowing that the boy's brilliance, combined with the absence of conscience, made him a singularly dangerous phenomenon. The knowledge was a weight he carried, a reminder that some children are born with a darkness that cannot be corrected, only contained temporarily. In those quiet halls, the echo of Timothy's mind lingered. The ciphers in his journal, the calculated tears, the subtle psychological traps, all of it testified to a child who understood life as a series of experiments and humanity as a set of variables to be observed, recorded, and exploited. He had survived, not through force, but through intelligence, patience, and an uncanny ability to appear innocent while preparing for horrors that only he could imagine. And as the days passed, the hospital became a place of silent tension, every staff member aware, consciously or unconsciously, of a mind that had once dissected them with surgical precision. The legend of Timothy Caldwell endured, not just as a tale of a child criminal, but as a chilling testament to the truth that monsters do not always wear visible fangs, and that intelligence without conscience can be the most terrifying force of all. The Gospel of the Haunted held the story in all its horror and fascination, a reminder that evil can be calculated, methodical, and patient, and that even within the seeming innocence of a child, darkness may dwell, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself once more. The weeks leading up to Timothy Caldwell's disappearance were marked by subtle, almost imperceptible lapses in the hospital's strict routines. Guards admitted later that they had allowed him slightly longer walks in the courtyard, extra reading materials, and minor adjustments to his daily regimen, decisions that seemed harmless at the time but, in retrospect, formed the invisible threads of opportunity he would eventually weave into his escape. For 18 months, Timothy had been quietly observing, recording, and analyzing every detail of the Missouri State Hospital. He studied the rhythms of staff interactions, the vulnerabilities in their routines, the subtleties of fear and trust, cataloging them all with the patience of a scholar and the precision of a predator. Dr. Harding, in his final report, noted with chilling clarity that by the moment Timothy made his move, he understood the psychology of everyone there better than they understood themselves. The escape was no rash act of desperation. It was the inevitable conclusion of a strategy executed with meticulous foresight. After Timothy vanished, the shadow of his presence lingered, unseen yet undeniable. Dr. Harding began tracking suspicious incidents throughout the Midwest, finding a disturbing pattern accidents that bore uncanny resemblance to Timothy's methods. Deaths that were labeled unfortunate or coincidental, but revealed a meticulous orchestration upon closer inspection. Animals were found tortured in ways that suggested experimentation, their suffering recorded with a scientist's detachment. Children and adults alike experienced accidents that seemed almost random, yet their timing, context, and execution suggested something far more calculated. Timothy had grown older, stronger, sharper, and his previous capture was a distant memory, leaving him free to operate with a terrifying combination of intelligence, skill, and moral vacancy. Dr. Harding devoted the remainder of his career to piecing together the evidence, filling journals with hundreds of pages detailing incidents that might have involved Timothy, alongside reflections on the nature of evil and the potential for humans to be born without moral compasses. Each entry forced him to confront the terrifying reality that Timothy Caldwell was not merely a disturbed child, but a living experiment in the manipulation of human behavior, a mind capable of calculating fear, trust, and compliance with a precision that left trained professionals unprepared. Questions about the reliability of psychiatric evaluation, about the assumption of inherent childhood innocence, haunted Dr. Harding's records. Timothy had exposed a vulnerability in the very systems designed to contain him. Intelligence divorced from conscience is a force far more dangerous than brute strength alone. The Caldwell farm, once a home, became a monument to terror. Thomas and Sarah, forever scarred by their brush with mortality, could not remain where they had unwittingly harbored a killer for nearly 2 years. They abandoned the property, leaving it to the county before it was sold to developers decades later, yet local residents avoided it for generations. The cave where Timothy had conducted his experiments was sealed, but its memory never faded. Legends whispered of curses, of animals that refused to graze, of the lingering presence of something unnatural and intelligent. Dr. Harding's own journals, donated to the Missouri Historical Society decades later, revealed a man obsessed with understanding the implications of Timothy Caldwell. He documented not only the details of the boy's behavior, but the broader lessons about human nature, how easily assumptions about innocence can be manipulated, how morality can be simulated, and how the darkest potentials can manifest in the smallest forms. Thomas and Sarah Caldwell never spoke publicly again. Living under assumed names, they feared the boy's return, believing he might one day complete what he had begun. Sarah died in 1889. Thomas followed 5 years later, leaving no children behind, a haunting silence as their only legacy. In the final entry of his journal, written days before his death in 1891, Dr. Harding reflected with grim acceptance on the truth he had unearthed over decades. He confessed that Timothy Caldwell was not an anomaly, but a glimpse into the extremes of human potential, when stripped of the emotional and moral constraints society assumes are universal. If he had survived to adulthood, Dr. Harding warned, there may well have been a man walking somewhere in America, possessing an understanding of psychology surpassing the most trained experts, manipulating life and death with a precision born of intellect untempered by empathy. Evil, Dr. Harding concluded, can wear the face of innocence. It can dwell in a child's smile, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The story of Timothy Caldwell, as preserved in the Gospel of the Haunted, remains a chilling meditation on the thin line separating curiosity from cruelty. It challenges our assumptions about childhood, morality, and the capacity for empathy, asking whether some individuals might be born with a void where conscience should reside. Even decades later, the mysteries surrounding Timothy's fate continue to haunt those willing to ask uncomfortable questions. Did he survive? Did he refine his techniques, moving unseen among the living? Could he be, even now, testing and observing, his intellect and patience growing sharper with each passing year? The tale lingers in the mind like a shadow that refuses to leave, a reminder that innocence can be a mask, and that human nature is not always bound by empathy. Timothy Caldwell's story challenges the limits of comprehension, warning that some minds, no matter how small, can contain a darkness older than history itself. The Gospel of the Haunted holds these events as both warning and fascination, illustrating how intelligence and cruelty can intertwine and how the world often fails to recognize a monster until it has already acted. Even now, the echoes of Timothy Caldwell's presence persist. The abandoned farm, the sealed cave, the meticulously preserved journals, and the lingering stories of unexplained accidents form a network of memory that refuses to be ignored. They remind us that evil does not always roar. It sometimes whispers, observes, and waits. And in the quietest corners, where curiosity meets the unknown, the legacy of Timothy Caldwell endures, a testament to the terrifying potential of a mind unbound, and the terrifying truth that sometimes the most innocent face may hide the darkest soul. The Gospel of the Haunted captures this story in all its chilling detail, a hypnotic testament to the patience of intellect untempered by conscience, and a warning that history sometimes holds lessons more frightening than any fiction could imagine.